movement known as aestheticism follows on the heels of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood in the late 1860s. This is an all-encompassing art movement, including poetry, painting, the decorative arts. It includes, the book we'll be discussing next week, Oscar Wilde's The Portrait of Dorian Gray. And this is a movement that calls for art's sake, with the theorizing help of John Ruskin. Unlike the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, the aestheticists did not believe that art should be about moralizing anymore or teaching history, that art instead should be about beauty. It should be aligned with music, which aestheticists believed was pure, a kind of pure art because of its absence of meaning, and its inherent abstraction. So this aestheticist movement, we'll just summarize really quickly, along with the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. I'll remind you, since we discussed it before. The pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood was more interested in truth to nature. Remember that hyper-realism of pre-Raphaelite paintings. And aestheticism is really different, right? Its commitments are different, this art for art's sake. So there was a realist impulse in the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, both of surface and of substance. In other words, the pre-Raphaelites had a realist commitment to style. Remember that fanatical attention to the outside world, those hours spent describing the botanical specimens in Millais' Ophelia. But there was also a realist impulse, and I'm saying realist with a capital R, to a sincerity of subject matter, a kind of moralistic impulse. Aestheticism will be a different movement, emphasizing the sensuous pleasures art can provide. Both will play a role in the formation of Impressionism in the French context, which of course would spread throughout the world. Both would also be a model for the kind of avant-garde movements that would really explode in the late 19th and 20th centuries. The pre-Raphaelites and the aestheticists would both be oppositional groups rejecting the authority of major institutions. They both would present themselves as being misunderstood, and both would have a strong group identity. I'm showing you Ford Madox Brown's work again from 1852 to 1865 to remind you of these twin impulses towards realism in the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. So, of course, the style here, this fanatical attention to the outside world. There's an incredible dedication to verisimilitude and illusionism in the work of the pre-Raphaelites. There's also, this painting really exemplifies this realist, capital R, sincerity of subject matter and morality, right? Here we have a painting about water reform, right, combating the spread of diseases like cholera. We see idealized labor. We see religious pamphleteering. So the artists, the pre-Raphaelites, were taking this sharp lens, this proliferation of detail, turned onto social issues, and that's the sort of twin commitment to realism. I'll remind you by showing you this slightly pixelated version of William Holman Hunt's Rienzi Vowing to Obtain Justice that you saw in our pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood meeting, that the artist Rossetti was the model for Rienzi's dead brother. So he's this sort of blonde youth that is laying across the center of the painting here. And this is to say that to give you some background out of which aestheticism emerges, Millais and Rossetti were involved with the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood for just around 10 years. Remember that there were 7 members to the Brotherhood. 3 were sort of the most prominent. That's Rossetti, Millais, and Holman Hunt, and you saw many of their paintings in our discussion of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. Rossetti was an English painter and poet. He came from a remarkable and talented family. His father was an exiled Italian patriot and scholar of Dante. His sister was a poet, Christina Rossetti, and his brother was a critic, William Michael Rossetti. He grew up in fairly modest circumstances, but again, this strong literary environment, and he first found it hard to decide whether he should devote himself to poetry or painting. Painting eventually became his profession, following the advice given to him by the poet and critic Leigh Hunt. Quote, "If you paint as well as you write, you may be a rich man." But Rossetti continued to write poetry and made translations from the Italian, and he has a kind of parallel history in literary scholarship. In 1849, at a London exhibition, Millais and Holman Hunt showed, right, in this Royal Academy exhibition. Rossetti showed the painting you'll see next, the Girlhood of the Virgin Mary, and Millais would show the paintings familiar to you, Isabella and Rienzi Vowing to Obtain Justice, which is on your screen. Remember that in this moment, right, 1849 was sort of their a big moment in the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. There weren't individual signatures that the artists used. Instead, they were signing their paintings PRB, really making a claim to collective authorship and intertwined social relations, both of which we'll see as aestheticism emerges out of the intense bonds out of these 3 men. And here, as we continue with our emphasis on Rossetti for a moment, I'm showing you the Girlhood of Mary, the Virgin Mary, that he painted between 1848 and 1849 and showed at that Royal Academy show in 1849. The Virgin Mary in this painting is shown as a young girl working on an embroidery guided by her mother, Anne. Her father, Joachim, is shown pruning a vine in the middle ground of the painting. And like Christ in the house of his parents, this picture is full of symbolic details. The palm branch and thorn on the floor allude to Christ's passion, the lilies to the Virgin's purity, and the books to the virtues of hope, faith, and charity. The dove sitting in the left side of the canvas represents the Holy Spirit. So this is quite typical of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, that the subject matter turns back to past art, not only in its subject, but in its style, right? This deliberately archaizing style. In other words, a style that looks intentionally naive to modern conventions. We talked about this last time. And this naivete, this deliberate naivete, remember, is a kind of avant-garde critique against what the Pre-Raphaelites believed was decadence and decline in art at the mid-century. They also show this hypervaluation of realism, right, and naturalism, and a rethinking of religious painting. So this was Rossetti's first completed oil painting, and the first picture that he exhibited with the initials PRB for the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. The painting was warmly praised and sold well, but the subsequent abuse that the Pre-Raphaelites received hurt Rossetti so much that he rarely exhibited again in public. In the 1850s, he virtually gave up oil painting and concentrated on watercolors of medieval subjects. These found ready buyers, often through contacts with John Ruskin, the critic, whom Rossetti met in 1854. And Rossetti proved to be a hard and skillful businessman. By the 1860s, he was earning the very substantial sum of about £3,000 a year. He probably met his future wife and frequent model, Elizabeth Siddall, in late 1849. They would marry in 1860. And in April 1850, he exhibited Ecce Ancilla Domini at the National Institution, but again, rarely showed anything after the painting's negative reception. And here is that painting, Rossetti's Ecce Ancilla Domini, that he exhibited in April of 1850. Inspired, as you can see, by the work of early Renaissance artists like Botticelli and Fra Angelico, and I'm showing you one of his frescoes on the left, Rossetti sought in this work to make a radical reinterpretation of the Christian story of the Annunciation. Traditionally, in Annunciation imagery, the Virgin Mary is depicted in studious contemplation, reading a missal, so shown reading and in prayer. But here, Rossetti shows her rising awkwardly from a low bed as if disturbed from sleep, while the angel Gabriel presents her with a white lily. Both figures are dressed in white, a symbol of the Virgin's purity, and the angel's role as the messenger of God is emphasized by the small white dove hovering beside him, signifying the presence of the Holy Spirit. You can see the dove coming in from the window. Rossetti used several sitters for his figures, including his brother William Michael for the angel and his sister Christina for the Virgin Mary. A companion piece showing the Virgin's death was planned by Rossetti, but never started. This partially explains the tall, narrow shape of the canvas, which was intended as part of a diptych, or pair. Rossetti intentionally restricted his palette to almost entirely white and the three primary colors. You can see blue, symbolic of heaven in the Christian tradition. It's also traditionally associated with the Virgin. There's also red in that post on the right-hand side of the canvas, which is symbolic of the blood of Christ. Rossetti even sought a red-haired model for the Virgin's head. The composition is carefully thought out. The vertical division of space made by the blue hanging in the edge of the bed falls almost on the golden section. Again, another sort of early Renaissance principle. The dove and the lily, with one bud still to burst open, move across the division and are instruments of the conception of Christ. Rossetti has written the date March at the bottom of the canvas, perhaps to signify the month in which the Feast of the Immaculate Conception is held in the Catholic calendar. The original frame, and you remember the pre-Raphaelites made elaborate frames, was also inscribed with Latin mottos copied from a brass rubbing owned by the fellow member of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, F.G. Stevens, who we haven't talked much about. This painting was exhibited at the National Institution in 1850 and heavily criticized, in part for its didacticism or its efforts to instruct, which was, of course, a typical use for paintings during the Renaissance and medieval periods. The critic for the Athenaeum wrote that it was a work, quote, evidently thrust by the artist into the eye of the spectator, more with the presumption of a teacher than in the modesty of a hopeful and true aspiration after excellence. That was in 1850. Rossetti vowed never to exhibit in public again, but he continued to work on his paintings until 1853, when this canvas, after some touch-ups, was sold to a collector in Belfast, an early patron of the Pre-Raphaelites, Francis McCracken, for £50. In 1860, as I said, Rossetti married the beautiful but sickly Elizabeth Siddall, the archetypal pre-Raphaelite stunner, after a long and sometimes vexed liaison. Siddall came into the pre-Raphaelite circle at the end of 1849 or early 1850, first serving as a model, and she was, in fact, the model for Millais in his Shakespearean Ophelia painting, which we've discussed. Siddall had distinctive red hair, heavily lidded eyes, and a small mouth, which became crucial aspects in the shared aesthetic of early pre-Raphaelitism. After 1852, she was sitting exclusively for Rossetti, and he also encouraged her to draw, to create her own artworks. In this image, her melancholy face is haunting, and Rossetti portrays her again and again in his oeuvre at this moment. Ford Madox Brown said in 1855, "It's like a monomania with him," meaning the representation of Elizabeth. Rossetti immortalized Siddall mainly in drawings, for in spite of his hatred for academic discipline that made him so disdainful of the official art world, he was an outstanding draftsman. Elizabeth died from an overdose of laudanum, possibly deliberate, in 1862, and Rossetti was devastated. As a gesture of his grief, he had the only complete manuscript of his poems placed in her coffin. He was persuaded to have them exhumed in 1869, and they were published the following year. As you'll see, this is very in the aestheticist tradition. Rossetti painted the image you'll see next, the very spiritual painting, Beata Beatrix, as a memorial to Elizabeth following her death. Beata Beatrix, which lives at the Tate Museum in London, is a memorial to the artist's recently deceased wife, expressing his love for her as a parallel to Dante's love for Beatrice. The painting is dated 1864, but it was worked on over a period of several years, so you can see a sort of longer date. Rossetti draws a parallel in this picture between the Italian poet Dante's despair at the death of his beloved Beatrice and his own grief at the death of Elizabeth, who died in February of 1862. Dante recounted the story of his unrequited love and subsequent mourning for Beatrice Portinari in the Vita Nuova, and remember that Rossetti's father was a Dante scholar. This was Rossetti's first English translation and appeared in 1864 as a part of his own publication, The Early Italian Poets. The picture is a portrait of Elizabeth Siddall in the character of Beatrice. It has a hazy, transcendental quality, giving it the sensation of a dream or vision, and is filled with symbolic references. Rossetti intended to represent her not at the moment of death, but transformed by a sudden spiritual transfiguration. And this is a quote from Wilson, quoting a letter from 1873, so from Rossetti's own account. She's posed here in an attitude of ecstasy, with her hands in front of her, her lips parted, as if she's about to receive communion. According to Rossetti's friend F.G. Stevens, the gray and green of her dress signify the colors of hope and sorrow, as well as love and life. In the background of the picture, you see a shadowy figure of Dante, who looks across at love, portrayed as an angel, holding in her palm the flickering flame of Beatrice's life. And again, that sort of hazy quality that you see in digital reproduction. Some of that is in the original. In the distance, you see the Ponte Vecchio, signifying the city of Florence, the setting of Dante's story. Beatrice's impending death is evoked by the dove, the symbol of the Holy Spirit, which we've seen in Rossetti's work before, which descends toward her, an opium poppy in its beak. This is also a reference to the actual death of Elizabeth Siddal, who was known by Rossetti affectionately as the Dove, and who, as I mentioned, took her own life with an overdose of an opioid, laudanum. Both the dove and the figure of love are red, the color of passion, but Rossetti envisioned the bird as a messenger, not of love in this case, but of death. Beatrice's death, which occurred on June 9th in the year 1290, is foreseen in the sundial, which casts its shadow over the number 9, the time that Beatrice had died. The picture frame, which was designed by Rossetti, has further references to death and mourning, including the date of Beatrice's death and the phrase from Lamentations, quoted by Dante in the Vita Nuova, "How doth the city sit solitary," referring to the mourning of Beatrice's death throughout the city of Florence. By the time of Elizabeth's death, Dante Gabriel Rossetti had returned to oil painting, and in the last 2 decades of his life, his subject matter was confined almost exclusively to beautiful women portrayed in a richly sensuous manner, often invoking literary or mythological references. Here is one of those canvases. And you can see that this is a new model. Elizabeth was replaced as his favorite model by William Morris's wife, Janie, who became in Rossetti's pictures one of the archetypal femme fatales, all cascading curls, pouting lips, and smoldering eyes. Rossetti had met Morris and Burne-Jones. We'll discuss both of these artists in more depth in lectures coming up, in 1856, and entered into a partnership with them in 1861 in the decorative arts firm later known as Morris and Company. But both these business and personal relationships became quite strained. Rossetti was in love with Janie, and he and Morris parted acrimoniously in 1875. Here we see Janie as Proserpine. In the classical myth, Proserpine was kidnapped by Pluto, the god of the underworld, to be his wife. She begged to be returned to Earth, but because she had eaten some pomegranate seeds, Pluto confined her to his kingdom for half of the year. She is shown here eating a pomegranate, which symbolizes her captivity, and is quite erotic in its representation here. Jane Morris, the model for Proserpine, was married to Morris at the time, but was also Rossetti's lover. She was unhappy in her marriage, and Rossetti may have seen her as this kind of captive goddess, confined to a kingdom by a vengeful god. In his later years, Rossetti became an eccentric recluse. He had a menagerie of unusual animals, including the wombat you see on your screen, the death of which occasioned a poem, and I just love this little sketch by Rossetti's friend, William Bell Scott. He fought a losing battle against drugs and alcohol and died paralyzed and prematurely aged. He was nevertheless a commanding personality, both in the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood and the burgeoning aestheticism movement, and his work was highly influential. His romantic medievalism inspired the second wave of Pre-Raphaelitism associated with William Burne-Jones, again who we'll discuss, and other followers, and his femme fatales appealed to the later symbolist movement and had a legion of descendants, especially during the turn of the century taste for decadence. And femme fatales, of course, these sort of erotic and dangerous women continue to be a sort of trope in cultural production today. I'm showing you John Everett Millais' Ophelia again to remind you of some of the grounding principles of pre-Raphaelitism, but as oppositional as aestheticism was to the pre-Raphaelite goals, there are some seeds of ideas here that would emerge or sort of bloom into the art for art's sake ideas. So this painting, of course, we focused on the naturalism here, the care that Millais took describing the natural world, right? Each botanical specimen represented in almost scientific clarity and precision, which leaves us with this large canvas where there's no escape from this kind of detail. Our eye doesn't know where to rest, right? We're not given the kind of typical kind of instruction about what part of the painting is important, in this case the human figure, which, as you remember, Millais painted last and not first, in defiance of academic tradition. And we see in this presentation of Ophelia a scene from Hamlet, taking a scene which took place actually off the stage. So he's not reproducing a kind of set piece from Shakespeare's play, but instead the drowning of Ophelia, she drowns herself, a ghastly act that is understood but takes place off stage. So Millais picks this moment to represent, and while we see, right, the moralizing qualities, the hyperrealism of the pre-Raphaelite priorities, we can also see here this sort of strange choice where he depicts a woman in a kind of alternate state of consciousness, right, if you look closely at her face. There's a connection in a lot of the aestheticist work that we'll see between the eroticism of sleep and death. Millais' later subjects will all be about sort of the life of the senses, and here we see this emerging in his interests. She's sort of half conscious, about, in the process of drowning herself. But as she's submerged in the water, the parts of her that have floated to the surface, right, her neck, her face, her hands, are sort of receptors for sensation, right, for touch and sight and taste and smell. And we're going to see sort of heightened sensation and sensuality be very central to the aestheticist project. To highlight this move from literary subjects and moral subjects, that didacticism that the pre-Raphaelites were really criticized for, and toward this sort of empty sensuality, I'm showing you Rossetti's Bocca Boccaccia of 1859, a very famous painting by the artist, and John Everett Millais' Autumn Leaves from the same year. In Bocca Boccaccia, we see another image of beautiful women with floral adjuncts. I'm quoting a critic here, right? Look too at his image of Elizabeth from earlier in the lecture with that red necklace. The costume, the composition, the tight floral background references the Venetian High Renaissance. And Bocca Boccaccia began as a technical exercise. The literary significance of the title came much later. So here we see the artist beginning to move away from narrative, even from those sort of literary and poetic allusions that define sort of the late pre-Raphaelite paintings. I'm just moving in a bit closer as we continue to talk about Bocca Boccaccia, this incredible painting. So the title, the literary reference is merely a pretense. And the viewer is meant to take a role in constructing the meaning here. We're close up on this portrait of a woman, again, Elizabeth Siddall as the model. But she's shown here as there's a boundary between her and us, right? This sort of table in between sitter and viewer here, on which there rests a fruit. Her hands are on top of the table. She's grasping a piece of her hair. This is very common in aestheticist art, where sort of sensation, the smell of the flowers, both in her hand and her hair, the sensation of touch is activated, right? The feeling of stroking sort of silky hair, her eyesight, her neck exposed and lengthened by the artist gives a sort of sensual quality to this painting as well. That neck in particular is not a sort of represented as being traditionally feminine for this moment. I wouldn't go as far as to say that it's masculine according to the sort of gender codes of the moment, but aestheticist painting, especially in the hands of Rossetti, tended to sort of play between the boundaries of gender norms, showing women with sort of vaguely masculine qualities and effeminate men. This was part, this sort of play and teasing at boundaries was part of the defiance of norms and the eroticism that charged these paintings. And it was an eroticism in both symbolism, right, the sort of fruit, the stroking hair, but also the paint handling, right? This is not the kind of sharp, overly lit, painfully stark painting of the pre-Raphaelite moralistic paintings. Aestheticist paintings have this softer quality, right, reflecting that sort of ease and pleasure in the handling itself as well. We'll see this in Impressionism too. The flowers that this woman holds show both represent, and this is according to some art historians that have thought a lot about this painting, are shown both as a kind of replacement for a phallus, but also this profusion of this obsessive investment in the female form, right? Flower as female genitalia, so sort of both, signaling a dualism and a kind of anxiety here. Millais' painting Autumn Leaves is also a picture without much of a subject, right? We've departed quite far from Christ in the house of his parents here. The meanings are not direct or morally serious, but more indirect. This is just young girls piling autumn leaves together, sort of taking pleasure in the changing of the seasons, the crunch of leaves, the touch here. And the paint in Millais' Autumn Leaves is more evocative than descriptive, right? Not every space, not every inch of the canvas is has that sort of hyper-realistic, obsessive detail here. There are moments where one's vision is not encouraged to focus, where it even fails here. And in Autumn Leaves, we have that evocation of sensory experience, right? Just like Bocca Boccaccia. In Bocca, the woman is touching her hair and flowers, sort of charging up her senses. We see her inhabitation of a sensate body, her different modes of experience in that body. In Autumn Leaves, the sensory experience is displaced onto us, the viewer. there's a lack of a definite subject. We're moving out of a narrative subject. More directly, the artist is thematizing the relationship between artwork and viewer, right? We sort of join the circle, contributing to meaning, smelling the autumn smells, taking part in the kind of pleasures activated in the painting. This is Millais' The Knight Errant from 1870. This is a large painting in which the figures are almost life-sized. When it was shown at the Royal Academy in 1870, it was accompanied by a text of Millais' own invention, printed in the exhibition catalog. I'll quote from that briefly. "The Order of Knights Errant was instituted to protect widows and orphans and to succor maidens in distress." So this moonlit scene depicts an act of medieval chivalry that text helps us to understand, in which one knight, clad in armor at the right, and Millais studied examples of knights' armor at the Tower of London. He is about to free a woman who has been stripped of her clothes and tied to a tree. The tree has meaning. It's a silver birch, and it was commonly identified with the female gender in the 19th century, sometimes related to or referred to as the lady birch. Birch twigs were also traditionally used in flagellation. The women's clothes lie on the ground to her left, and we assume her to have been robbed. Are seen fleeing the scene, those robbers, in the top right corner of the canvas. Sort of hard to see in reproduction. There is blood on the knight's sword, and the torso of a dead man is visible just behind him. The Knight Errant was Millais' first and only attempt at painting a female nude, and critical reviews of the painting focused on his treatment of this unclothed woman. The ambiguity of the subject and the nude figure caused some consternations among critics who thought the woman was too lifelike, right? Not sort of idealized in the mode of history painting or those classicized images that we're used to seeing. And I show you this painting as an example of Millais' work, but also to show you the kind of resurgence of medievalism in the aestheticist practice, right? We saw some of this in the pre-Raphaelite focus, but it's going to continue with Edward Burne-Jones in our next meeting, this sort of sensual medievalism. So we'll end with an image that we'll discuss in more detail in our meeting on Burne-Jones, when we further explore this branch of British aestheticism that has such a sort of medieval quality and medieval obsession. Remember, to wrap up, that the aesthetic call to arms was art for art's sake. So gone again were the moralizing tendencies of the pre-Raphaelites, and in their place came a love of symbolism, a beauty evacuated of much storytelling, and connections, as we'll continue to see, with music as a pure art form. The aesthetic movement flourished in England in the 1870s and 1880s, and again crossed between the visual arts, the decorative arts, and literature. J.M. Whistler was part of the aesthetic movement. Frederick Lord Leighton. We'll see the Japanese influence on the aesthetic movement in our future meetings. In the decorative arts, it can be seen as part of this revolution initiated by William Morris, which we will discuss. And the ideals of aestheticism were commercialized both by Morris and the Liberty store in London. Liberty is still an active brand today, and was later popularized by Art Nouveau, if you're familiar with that movement, which carries a lot of the same principles as aestheticism. So this is an important movement to understand, and really represents a lot of these avant-garde ideas towards the end of the 19th century in Britain.